Anyway, well, welcome. You all know what's happening today. It is Ask Colin Anything, drop-in hours. A good time will be had by all. So please have your questions ready. Colin likes them really, really complex and confusing because then he can show off just how smart he is. I'm just going to smile. That's my job, to smile and look reasonable. With that, Colin is event number 2 in September. He's a superstar this month. So we do have our open event is September 23rd. And that is what's worth more, time or money. And yes, Dr. West will tell you more. We actually did this as a membership event months ago, and it was so well received that we decided to bounce it up to a full-blown open event. In his research, if you look in the calendar invite, the research has been featured in Discover Magazine and many other places. So do come along. It is awesome and interesting. We had a teardown with Kristen, who has returned from maternity leave last week. That was good fun. Let's see. This Friday, we have behavioral science secrets for more productive meetings with Lindsay Juarez. She is awesome. And the presentation, I've seen the deck. It looks great as well. So if you don't know about Colin, you haven't been coming to enough events. He's here like at least once a month, but just pretend you don't know about him. He is awesome. He's actually now in Lisbon. He just informed me he has an Italian wedding he's going to. Oh, such challenges in your life, Colin. But he's a postdoctoral research fellow at University of Toronto. What is their mascot, Colin?
It's very underwhelming, Ryan. It's just the blues. It's very lame.
I don't even know what to do with that. So I could say you're a blue, but then people might think you're depressed. And I just...
I do. So the group that I work with at University of Toronto is called BEAR, Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman. So we'll go with the BEAR.
Or a blue bear. Yeah.
Sure, let's do blue bear.
Yeah, a blue bear. So he could, the things you learn. He conducts research in behavioral science with a focus on economic decision-making and psychological well-being in the workplace. His doc is from the other bear place, UCLA. Actually, they're Bruins. I guess Cal's the Bears. They're the Bruins. Almost got in trouble there, Colin. And his bachelor's in social studies from Harvard. His research investigates how our resources of time and money shape decision-making and well-being, from droughts and diseases to bonuses and vacations. Periods of scarcity and abundance provide a critical window into judgment, decision-making, suffering, and most importantly, for all of our purposes, flourishing. Prior to his doc, he worked as a consultant and researcher applying behavioral science in business and policy settings at BE Works, a Toronto-based consulting firm dedicated to applied behavioral economics, very similar to ours, and the Bucera Center for Behavioral Economics, a U.S. nonprofit based in Nairobi. So that is the show today. It is now Colin's to take over. I still haven't made you a co-host, Colin, but I will. And so let the games begin. Who has a profound or just silly question or something they'd like torn down that they'd like to share with Colin today?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And good to see some familiar faces and happy to chat and take any questions you guys have.
Yeah, I'm going to spotlight you so it seems more intense. Spotlight on you, Colin. You're the man. And make co-host. So as people, the Italian national team is called the Light Blue. It's not bad. Nice to know. I'll start with a question as people are getting warmed up. And so what did you see an interesting application of behavioral science on your travels from Canada to Spagnando?
Well, I will say one thing that's been on my mind a little bit is in Canada, there's been a huge problem with delays in travel. I'm sure this is from what I understand true in the United States as well, and a lot of places around the world. And so people are, waiting extra long for taking flights and collecting their bags. And so we're essentially imposing, extra time costs on millions of people, week in, week out. And this, to me, it fits with some of the research that I've spent a lot of time doing on how we value time. and how we might think about time and cost benefit analyses. And one thing that I think is this exemplifies, and it's true in a lot of domains in our life, is we don't pay much attention or seem to be willing to invest much money in saving people time or avoiding small time costs, right? You could imagine the government of Canada or US government could start paying some of the people who are doing the security checks at airports much more. If there's a shortage of staff, they could think a lot of this is fixable with money, is my point. And the cost is not money, it's time, right? And I think this is a perfect example of an instance where we've got a huge amount of wasted time and little invested money to save that amount of time. So it speaks to how we value time, as a society, and how the government values its citizens' time. And then it's also true, I'm sure in a lot of your working lives, you think of like some small admin task that your boss wants you to do, or that your company requires that you do, that extra little bit of paperwork or admin. People think, oh, that's not, that's trivial. It's not a big deal to ask our employees to do that. But then they don't track how these small time costs build up. So you think of like that, that next little admin cost, even if it's only a few minutes, that's a few minutes, maybe it's once a month or once a quarter across the entire company in perpetuity. And you never see time costs being taken away. You almost always see them just slowly accumulating. And then that can add up to a pretty substantial time cost that employers are putting onto their employees. And a lot of my research has shown that basically we're undervaluing our time, and governments should spend more money to try to save their citizens' time, and it returns in GDP production and per capita. And companies should spend more money trying to save their employees' time. It returns in less turnover and more productivity, more creativity, more collaboration. That these small time costs are something we shouldn't ignore. So I didn't have the worst experience traveling, but I did find myself getting very frustrated with I'm Canadian, and Toronto Airport has been one of the most delayed in the world. And we are not spending the money that we need to in order to save people time.
So tell me a little bit about the research on time savings and GDP. You dropped that little nugget in there.
Yeah, there's some good cost benefit analysis research. So if you think of like when a company does a cost benefit analysis or an ROI, or if you're thinking of a new policy, right? A lot of the time, governments will think about how much does this cost, how much does this program cost, and what will the return be, right? And usually time is not factored into these equations, right? You think of, okay, we're going to invest in R&D and we're going to see what the economic return is down the road. And that's how to decide whether a policy is worth it or not. And the same for a company, you think, hey, we're going to invest capital into this new business. Is it going to return and have an ROI, right? So, and in this case, what I've been researching, and there's been also some great work from others in this field, looking at if you try to save people time, how does that, do we see an ROI on time savings showing up in GDP growth and productivity? And the answer is a strong yes. Like, there's been some really interesting stuff on Cass Sunstein has passed something called the Paperwork Reduction Act. It was initially under Clinton, and then it was expanded under both Bush and Obama, that was trying to reduce the amount of paperwork that the federal government imposed on US citizens. And they found that states that went further in reducing paperwork burden actually saw an uptick in productivity. You're taking people who otherwise might be working and having them do all this arduous paperwork. So there's one smaller example, but then it's also true of like when bridges are built, when extra infrastructure is built, so people's commute times are reduced. Right? If you can create the infrastructure to save people time, you actually do cumulatively over thousands and millions of people see this showing up in productivity.
Wow, that's exciting. I would say that there's a lot of low hanging time. Like there's a lot of cuts we can make, huh?
I mean, I'll give a couple stats on this. So for instance, Cass Sunstein's group has estimated that the US federal government imposes about 11 billion hours of paperwork on US citizens every year. So it's cumulative, right? So that's just federal government. So federal government paperwork, think of you are applying for permits and licenses. Yeah, you are filling out your taxes, you are paying a parking ticket, all of the arduous processes that we go through, sum to 11 billion hours of paperwork. And then you've got your local level stuff, right? So it's a huge amount. This has been, Cass Sunstein's made this point many times, and this has been a theme of my research, that very little money. It's usually governments have a hard time, and companies too have a hard time saying, oh, we're going to invest, some substantial chunk of money, just to save people a little bit of time. And they don't think of like, okay, well, you're saving everyone a little bit of time repeatedly. So anyway, I think this shows that we often still undervalue time.
Yeah, so if you get enough grains of sand, before you know it, you have a beach.
There you go.
This I hear. All right, Dr. Summers, only representing your little piece of Canada, not the entire country, to be clear. Bring it, and I hope it's awesome.
Thanks. Hi, Colin. We've just taken part in a federal government survey looking at women entrepreneurs' attempts to access capital. And spoiler alert, the bottom line is that their experience has been often not great. And what we're trying to do is create a kind of sludge audit process for lending institutions, one that would help bust the mental models that a lot of women entrepreneurs have, which is that there's nothing out there for them. And sometimes it turns out there isn't much out there for them. One of the things that we're butting up against is exactly this time thing, that institutions and even design teams that I've been part of, they really want to rely on client education, on educational videos, on links that will explain the process, rather than on removing sludge in the application process. And I'm wondering, just can you talk to that? Speak to me of this, Prophet. How do you, as a consultant, help the team take on the challenge of improving their process rather than constantly offloading?
Yeah, I mean, I think your intuition is in the right direction there, which is education for this instance. And in a lot of times when we're trying to change behavior, one of the core things that we as behavioral scientists say is do not provide information. We're not in the game of providing information. We're in the game of changing behavior. And you have to think in terms of processes and friction points and sludge when you're thinking about behavior change. So the client education stuff, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. I would predict that would not work. And it certainly has not worked in other domains, right? So think of financial literacy education. There's been a huge amount of work showing that that's not very effective, right? So I think there's also been some similar work that very well intentioned, like the Gates Foundation doing kind of health literacy and child health literacy in developing countries, and having just providing information or having them do like seminars, and it does not move the needle on actually changing health behaviors, right? And what we care about are health behaviors. If it did move the needle, we'd say, yeah, we just want to know what works, right? We don't care whether it's not that we're against education. We just don't see it in these domains it working very well. So I think that's a good point, and I think that's what we want to encourage, is that you should test it, because I think some people really get tied to education as very altruistic or empowering, and that sounds great. But this is sometimes when I work with charities, I say, yeah, okay, we can try education, but let's at least make sure we're rigorously measuring whether it's moving the needle on the behaviors that we care about. And my prediction usually is that it won't, but I'm open to charities trying, right? In this case, I would just really want these. If you're trying to think of access to capital for women entrepreneurs, I would want to measure whether this client education is having any impact, right? And the only way the best way to measure it, right, is to do it in a randomized or quasi-randomized controlled trial, where you are randomly assigning some of these aspiring entrepreneurs to receive the education, others to not, and then observing whether there's any difference in their access to capital, right? So that would be one way to think about this. The other approach would be something like a matched pairs design. Basically, you find pairs of entrepreneurs that look fairly similar. Maybe they're in a similar industry, similar age, and you try to find, say 100 pairs of entrepreneurs, and you randomly assign 50 of them to get the client education and 50 of them to not receive it. And then you see whether it moves the needle, right? So my hunch is that the answer is no, which you're already going down. But I always try to be data driven and not just go with, oh, I think it's not going to work. Okay, if you really care about financial education, or in this case, education on raising capital, put your money where your mouth is, and have some rigorous metrics around if what you're doing is actually working.
Well, part of the reason for the cynicism about that is that in the focus groups we did, as well as in the survey data, it came back loud and clear that time is money for folks, and when they're faced with a scarcity of each, they will invest their time in revenue generating opportunities that have more direct, that are under more direct control, and trying to wade their way through onerous loan applications with uncertain outcomes just doesn't make it on the radar. So it's not just, this is what we feel. It's like, this is what the clients are saying.
Yeah, I think that's something to mention. There's also, if you look at time use data around the world, women tend to be more time poor than men on average, right? So it's not as bad in places like Canada or the United States as it is in developing countries, where the gap in terms of like total hours of paid and unpaid labor is wider, but it still does exist in Canada and the United States as well, particularly young mothers, right? So if you've got a young mother who is trying to also be an entrepreneur, they're likely to be especially time poor as well. So then that is the perfect example where small amounts of time costs, right, that might seem trivial, a few hours here and there, can actually have big deterring effects on preventing them getting access to capital. So I think that's one. And then you mentioned the alternative route of reducing sludge. I'd also say, like, you might want to think of, there's just a motivation element here too, which you just touched on, which is, if I don't think that I'm going to jump through all these hoops and I'm probably not going to get a loan anyway, that's extremely demotivating, right? So we think of like one model of motivation that is kind of a classic model of motivation, which is what we call the EPO model. And that is kind of a 3-step process, right? So you think of like the E is expectations, the P is performance, and the O is outcome. And in this case, you think of, okay, what do I expect to happen if I take these actions? If I do perform well on what's expected of me, the P, will I then get the outcome, right? So you think about the links between the E to P link and the P to O link. So the E to P link would be about, do I know what I need to do, right? Do I have is there clear expectations on what my performance needs to be in order to get this loan, right? So, okay, do I know what to do? Right? It has to be very, very clear. Otherwise, you're going to lose motivation. And then the P to O link is another thing that's kind of classic in the psychology of motivation, is if I do if I perform really well, I do exactly what is expected of me, will I receive the outcome, or is there some uncertainty there too? And this is kind of just a model of thinking through motivation. If either one of those links this is a perception in the minds of, in this case, women entrepreneurs, if either one of those links is either uncertain or broken, we're going to see a much lower motivation. So I think that, and then I'd also think of, okay, the sludge are all these deterrents, but what is the benefits of it, right? So that's kind of related to this motivation. If I go through all this effort, is the loan worth it? What's the cost benefit for me, right? If I'm thinking of, as you say, time is money, if I'm thinking of like the time investment I'm going to need, is the loan big enough? And is it on good enough terms for it to be worth all the effort? And I'll make one small anecdote here, is there's actually some really interesting data on food stamps applications in the United States. Something like 30% of all people who are eligible for food stamps actually go through the process to get them, right? So a lot of people are eligible, it's free money, and they're living low income and they're not going through the process, right? So here, we're thinking of, okay, there's a huge time cost to get these benefits, and it's actually deterring a lot of people, even those who are low income, because they're especially time poor, and they see this huge upfront effort for a small return. So those are just a few things I'd consider when you're trying to solve this issue and see if you can get better access to capital.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Colin, let me ask a follow-up question, because that's my job. Say you were given this job, say you became the minister of giving capital to female entrepreneurs in Canada, a very catchy name, probably accurate because it's government title. What would you do immediately? I mean, what kind of things might you put in place if money were no object?
Yeah, I would think about sludge first, just as Moira was doing, right? And I'd also then want to make the process really transparent, and that fits to the EPO model and the cost benefit that I'm doing with my time, right? So if I don't know exactly what the process is going to look like, and it feels arduous, oh, now I'm in serious, you're gonna see huge drop-offs, right, during the application process of people feeling like it's not worth it. So if you can do two things: reduce the amount of sludge, so this is the total amount of time and effort involved, right? And then two, you want to make it really transparent. If I do X and Y and Z, I'm eligible, and you might want to give them an estimate of their odds as well. If they think, you could include this in the survey as well. If you do this, what do you think your chances of getting the loan are, right? And if they think it's 1%, well, it's not worth my time, right? So you'd want, if in fact the odds are decent, and you say, okay, if you meet these criteria and you do X, Y, and Z, we grant loans to, say, 1 in 5. That might make a huge difference. And it could be that the terms are actually pretty good and the government's actually giving away a lot of money here, and it's just going underutilized because of transparency and perceptions.
I don't know. Was that you, Moira? Did your dog just escape? That was incredible sound effect. Very cool. So do we have other questions, or I will continue? Oh, Stephen. Oh, yeah. Tell us about that, Stephen. Come off mic.
Oh, yeah. So I was just going to do that. QuickBooks, inside your QuickBooks app or online, they have an option where they can analyze how your business is doing, essentially, because they have all your numbers, right? So super easy to apply for capital. But I was looking at the wording because I'm very, very critical of every single word when it comes to loans or whatever it is that's going to require looking into whatever my financial stuff. And the way they worded it, because it's finance, they're required with all these laws and things like that. They can't word things a certain way, or so on and so forth. I was gonna apply for the capital just to see what I would get, and then I literally was not gonna go a step further, because I was like, oh, that's gonna do a credit hit. And they worded it where it sounded like, no, this only gets reported to your business credit. But yet they're wanting to pull your personal in the little wording, the wording down below in really tiny print. It was making all these sort of like, it was very nebulous. So I literally stopped. Then I got an email from one of their people saying, hey, why did you stop? Like, we noticed that you didn't continue on with the application, and so on and so forth. And somehow there was some link on there, and it provided some extra information about the credit pull. Then it said, this is only a soft pull, so it won't hit your credit. And it's only if you take the loan, and then that gets applied to your business credit. Had they done that up front, I would have already clicked on it.
Yeah, I mean, you touch on a point here, which is a lot of businesses tried it. They think kind of purely in terms of incentives, right? If I offer somebody, this loan on pretty good terms, they'd be silly not to take it, right? And they think purely in terms of the economic incentives. And kind of one of the core lessons of behavioral economics is that it's the expectations in the mind of the consumer that really matter here. So you have to think about, okay, how, what is the information that the customer has? What are their expectations, and how might that influence their motivation to go down this road, right? So that's what we often try to do when Irrational Labs is working with clients. Is you think of walking through, what the customer journey is, and that doesn't just involve steps, right? They have to do, in order to get this loan, they have to fill out this paperwork. And then this next thing, we also think of, okay, what are their expectations and beliefs, knowing that they don't have as much information at each stage of the journey, right? And when we think of building businesses, sometimes we're so close to it. We think, we call this the curse of knowledge. It's hard to put yourself into the shoes of someone who doesn't have the same information as you, right? And that's why we do a lot of this research, to try to really get a good sense of the beliefs, expectations of the user at each point in time.
Yeah, like that right up front there, if it's interesting because the way they framed it, using that framing thing, if they had said, like you were mentioning, my chances or whatever, because they give this giant range, you can have this amount to this large amount. And I'm like, that doesn't help me. Like, that's this giant range. Like, I have no idea what you're going to give me. If
Yeah,
they
and perhaps at this stage they can't, they don't know, but them giving you that wide range just highlights the amount of uncertainty. So it's actually doing harm at that stage.
Yeah, it would have, if they added in there something like maybe, hey, give us a little bit of data about your bit, and we'll give you some idea of what you could get. Then you want me to do the poll? I probably would have already done it, because then I know what, like you said, the expectations. I'll give you a little bit of information, and then I'll give you more if I think it's worth it. So that extra, that little mid step in there, if they just added that, I think their conversion would like go up crazy.
Yeah, I'll say one other small thing here that is kind of a common theme with a lot of tech companies and banks that we work with, is in the onboarding process, in this case for a new product or for somebody joining a platform, we try to think of that as relationship building. So that involves give and get, right? If you're asking me as a new user to spend all this time putting in information, I need to feel a return on the time that I put in, right? Just in the way that you build a relationship. If I'm giving, I expect to get some value in return. So I think sometimes companies forget that too, and they say, oh, well, it's really valuable once you're on the platform, but the onboarding process is so arduous and you get nothing during that process, right? So sometimes we encourage companies to think of, okay, throughout the onboarding process, can I provide some small bits of value? It could be just in the form of like demonstrating what the value is going to be, but you have to remember that you can't assume that your user is going to be incredibly motivated to go jump through all the hoops that you set for them.
Yeah, that's a good point that you made on expectation, because that made me think exactly of, if I were to fix this with an intervention, that value that you're saying right there at the beginning, if I saw something that it increased the value of the time I'm going to put in, I would do it.
Yeah. I mean, and this is classic to behavioral economics, is we judge the value of things relative to a reference point. This is what we call prospect theory. It's also kind of the core lessons around loss aversion. We want to avoid losses, and losses are not about, zero as some magic number. It's our expectations, right? If you expect a bonus of $10,000 and you get an $8,000 bonus, people encode that mentally as a $2,000 loss, right? So expectations play a huge role in how we judge the events that happen to us. And as product designers, as when we're thinking of public policy and companies, we have to keep in mind people's expectations and how, what their reference points are.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Actually, Dr. Summers, you wanted to jump in on that because you know a little bit about finance. You want to add your 10 cents without interest?
Oh, I was just groaning about the whole credit score thing. One of the, in terms of people being able to get access to capital, and this is true, no matter sort of the net worth, they look at that's called the 5 C's: conditions, collateral, and one of them, which sounds so hopeful, is called character, but it actually means your credit rating. And so if you are a newcomer, if you were, unwise in your spending and your misspent youth, if you have been the victim of identity fraud, if you were married to a bum who took you to the cleaners, if you ever had to go to a payday loan company to feed your kids, you're automatically knocked out of the game. And there have been all of these kind of social experiments like access to microcredit, that sort of thing. But it's just, I would love to hear about alternatives to this model if you know of any. There's an organization in the States called Native Women Lead, which, and there's a number of indigenous venture capital funds that don't even look at the credit scores of the founders. They just look at other things like, is this a valuable enterprise? And do the other financial metrics make sense? But yeah, Colin or anybody on the call, if you know of other alternatives to credit scores, because I don't even know how predictive they are. We already know that Equifax scores are wildly inaccurate. About 20% of them are wrong, just wrong. And I don't know how predictive they are.
There is, so when I used to work over in East Africa, a lot of that was on microcredit, microinsurance, and trying to think of these different financial products that are aimed at people who were previously unbanked. It's kind of the term that's often used there for people who didn't, basically, Moira, you know this well, but for others, unbanked is essentially you've never had access to a formal financial product before. And in places like Canada and the US, of course, the vast majority of the population have some formal bank account. But if you go to a lot of the rest of the world, South America, Africa, parts of India, a lot of people have never had access to a formal bank account. And they're getting access often through their mobile phone, all of a sudden, to digital financial products. And this is a really, overall, a great thing. But, right, to the point about credit scoring, how do you credit score someone who's never had a credit card before, who's never even had a checking account before, and has no digital paper trail? So there's been some really creative and interesting ways of alternative credit scoring. So they're not throwing in credit scores away, but they're just calculating them in very different ways. So a couple examples is there's a US company called Tala, T-A-L-A, that operates in mostly in South America, that does alternative credit scoring. So it looks at like transaction history on mobile digital money, because mobile money is becoming more popular in places like Brazil. And there's similar ones that are through M-Pesa, which is in Kenya. And you can now get a transaction record of all the things you've spent money on. So they get a little picture of your financial history. And then sometimes they'll pair that with some surveys. And they're just coming up with clever ways of using alternative measures of credit scoring in order to try to estimate the risks of somebody who does not have a good maybe not even that they don't have a good credit history, they have no credit history. And so it's actually, ironically, the innovation here is happening in developing countries because they're forced to use other methods to do credit scoring. And there's often really sophisticated, interesting machine learning models going on here to try to predict default rates. So, I don't know how much this is going to change in the US, but for digital money and digital financial products in South America and Sub-Saharan Africa, there actually is a lot of progress on this.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that to me. Yeah, I don't think I'm about to change the Royal Bank of Canada in terms of how they give access to women entrepreneurs. The other thing that was coming out was just this notion that there's this big gap between the zero, like sort of the $1 to the $50,000 mark. And most banks don't want to touch anything lower than that. And so the default is credit cards. The default is credit cards. And there doesn't seem to be any creativity around lower cost options for people who need something not as risky as that. But the mental model that most of the entrepreneurs have is that debt is bad, it is best avoided, and I'm going to use my own savings, and I will use my credit cards, and hopefully in the intent to pay it off each month. But that's another one of the mental models that's hard to overcome, and then it becomes self-reinforcing. If the only product you have access to is a credit card, that will get you in trouble.
Yeah, and I will say, I think some of the fintechs that have generated quite a bit of media attention, you think of like Affirm and Klarna as being some of the big ones. It's the buy now, pay later models that kind of claim to be very different. It's often credit by another name. So I think you're right. There is this big problem of people who are a little bit lower income if they're starting a business or just in their personal credit, personal financial lives, that they end up having a really hard time getting access to credit.
Rihanna, can you jump in and add your layer to this discussion? No, you guys did. You walked into Colin's wheelhouse. Everybody didn't know, but this is some of Colin's favorite BE stuff. But Rihanna, can you verbalize what you talked?
Yeah, it was something I heard on a podcast. So I don't remember which one or which country they were talking about, but I do remember someone was saying that like in different countries, they calculate credit scores differently. So in the US, it helps your credit score, like the more you use credit and pay it off on time. But in other countries, it's actually like if you don't use your credit, that's a good thing. And the more you use your credit, the worse it is for your credit score. So I was just saying like another reason why alternatives are great, because it really helps with like cross-cultural boundaries, and if you move from one place to another, is that going to hurt your chances of what your credit score might look like?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think you're right, and certainly in developing countries, which is an area that I've worked in a lot on financial behaviors in developing countries. They certainly use they don't use the same measures of calculating credit scores, but it could be that that's true. I wonder places like Scandinavia, and I know there's kind of people in China, for instance, don't use credit nearly as often as Americans do. So yeah, that's an interesting point. I'll make one other point. Ryan mentioned is kind of my wheelhouse here of talking about microcredit. And I'll make one other kind of quick point on that, which is microcredit as a tool for poverty alleviation was kind of this really, people were very hopeful that giving people access to credit who are lower income would be a huge boon for poverty alleviation efforts. In fact, there was very hyperbolic language like microcredit as a cure for poverty. And Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank won the Nobel Prize for this in 2004, I believe. And it was seen as, if we can only get lower income people access to credit, they're going to be able to start businesses and move their family and invest in their better agricultural equipment, and that's just going to lift them all out of poverty. And it's been largely unsuccessful, despite all that attention. Microcredit it's not terrible, but it's not nearly the cure for poverty for obvious reasons. All of a sudden, people who have never had a financial product before get access to credit, often at fairly high interest rates. Well, what happens? They get into cycles of debt, right? So it actually can be less effective than you might expect. And what's been more effective, and some of the research that I've done in East Africa, is microinsurance, right? So you think of like small scale farmers having insurance if they don't have a good yield that season, that they can have an insurance policy that pays out a cash benefit is not enough if there's not enough rainfall, for instance, often linked to rainfall, and cash transfers as well, right? So if you're a charity and you're thinking, I should give people loans, that's the most effective way to do things. More recently, there's been much more attention on cash transfers, where you're just giving people money without those strings attached. So this is all to say that microcredit and a lot of these, there's been a shift and less attention on microcredit recently, especially in developing countries.
That's fascinating stuff. Little did we know we would go into the microcredit universe. Other questions, or I will ask Colin more questions. But anyone want to come off mic or raise your hand? Remember, he likes tricky questions. I generally only throw softballs.
I'll just go one more thing, because I think one really fascinating area of application for behavioral science is in fintech. And I think the areas in that has been more successful is not in micro loans, but in like micro savings, right? So you think of some companies that have been really, really successful, like an example would be Acorns, right? Acorns lets you round up and purchases that you make on a day-to-day basis and automatically contribute them to a savings account that gets put into an ETF, right? So you spend $2.50 on a coffee, you can pre-commit to automatically rounding up to $3, and that 50 cents goes into an ETF. Yeah, okay, these are small amounts of money, right? 50 cents contributing, but we're talking like lower down the income spectrum, people who previously had no savings. If you start that fairly early, all of a sudden, you've got $500, $1,000 in there, and it's compounding over time if you don't touch it. So there's a lot of fintechs that are coming up with creative ideas to try to get people to start savings, because that initial thing, if you've got no savings at all, that initial barrier can feel really daunting psychologically. And I think that's a great area for behavioral science. And I think, looks more promising than, the microcredit world.
Yeah, it's the default, it's the predetermined thing, right? That's always so powerful.
Yeah, that's a classic use of defaults, and a great one, and because it feels very small, right? It doesn't feel like a huge commitment to round up to the nearest dollar.
So, Stephen, bring it. You've got a question. Come on the mic. I keep saying come off the mic. I mean, come on the mic.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this. I'm not sure if this is like an answerable question. On one hand, I kind of know the second part of it, as far as the digital part of it, but when it comes to like measuring this idea that you were saying, this model, I think it was EPO, expectations, performance, and outcome.
That's right. Yeah.
So what would be a way to measure that, to get a sense of, okay, my problem isn't, let's say you have a behavior chain, and your objective is to first sort out if your prompts are the problem, right? And then work backwards and sort of see, okay, where's the barrier? And then you want to focus on motivation last, because that's the hardest one to pin down. If you've gone through this chain and you wind up at the end to finally address motivation, what would you use to sort of measure that, to start to figure out where you need to go to troubleshoot in that motivation sort of area?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? I mean, this is the tricky thing of behavioral science, is how do you measure something that is, a bit that's psychological, that's subjective, that can, this is the challenge of good social psychology and cognitive psychology, is putting rigorous metrics around something that seems kind of fluffy, like human motivation. And there's a lot of great behavioral science on this. I'll give a couple examples here, right? So if you're trying to think of, where people might be lacking motivation, is it in expectations? Is it in the kind of clear performance metrics that I need? Is it in my, belief that I'll get the outcome if I do the performance, right? So a couple ways to do it. I'll put them into two categories. One is what you might call behavioral proxies, right? So if I am a app, right? So say I'm a online banking, or I'm Meta, or I'm Apple, whatever it is, or Amazon, I can look at your, what you call clickstream data, which would be how you navigate through the platform, see what you're clicking on, and where you're leaving. And then this is why it's a proxy. So I don't know what your motivations are, but I'm making good inferences based on your behavior on the app, right? Or on the platform. And a lot of tech companies do a lot of that, right? That's like huge business of predictive analytics and data science and machine learning, is trying to predict your intentions, your expectations, how motivated you are based off of all the clickstream data that they get when you're on the platform. So that's one, right? And the other, and this is the field of, what we might call small data as opposed to big data. Now, we all get excited about big data. I happen to think small data is more interesting in a lot of ways. And by small data, I don't mean anecdote, right? But I do mean doing surveys or panel studies where you ask people about their motivations, not a handful, but in the hundreds or in the thousands. And you ask people targeted questions at different points in time about what were you intending to do here? Asking questions, not open-ended, often something like, how much would you be willing to pay for this right now? What do you think how risky is this at this stage? There's a whole bunch of questions that you could ask people to get a sense of what are the barriers, both logistically and as well as psychological barriers that they might be facing at any given time. So, and there's ways of measuring both extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. So like the famous researchers in this are this guy, DECI and Ryan. DC and Ryan have written tons of papers on the psychology of motivation and how to measure it. And you can just ask people a lot of this stuff, but you got to ask them the right kinds of questions that can be measured in a quantitative way, right? And as psychologists, one of the things that we want to do well is come up with good questions that can give people like a measure of how intrinsically motivated you are towards something, right? So that's the kind of just ask approach. But a lot of companies rely on like focus groups or just kind of interviewing a couple people. From a behavioral economics standpoint, we try to scale that up to say, don't ask 10 people, ask 1,000 people, and do it in a systematic way. Maybe you're tracking people over time and you're seeing, how their motivation shifts, how their intention shifts, whether they'd be willing to pay for something. So those are the kind of two broad approaches that a lot of tech companies would take and a lot of behavioral science companies would take: behavioral proxies and quantitative survey measures where you're just asking people.
So is this as I'm thinking about that, I'm like, if you look at the main motivators of, I'm trying to take a model that you're putting out there, and then I'm trying to fit in some other models to try to understand what you're saying. So let's say the main motivators would be sex, money, power, status. There might be a few more. They all seem to fall into a bucket. As you're trying to measure what somebody's after, they themselves tend to be disconnected with their own way of understanding their own needs and wants. So they don't have the language for it to even bring that to the front, because it takes almost like, a counselor to sit there and dig that out of you, right? To get you to use language to articulate, this is what's going on for me. This is what I want. So when they're buying something, I guess that's the challenge, is trying to figure out, they themselves don't know what it is they're hoping this thing is going to give them. Maybe they have like a subjective idea, like their system one brain is kind of going, this will get me a relationship. This will get me status somehow. So is that why it's really hard to sort of measure that, to understand which of those things they're after, that this thing they're looking to buy is going to give them?
I would say that behavioral science and behavioral economics, we focus more on inference as opposed to, the, deep psychology of, all people's like, desire for status or, desire for, human connection and all that stuff. That's, almost what clinical psychology would focus on as opposed to behavioral science. Now, behavioral science, that's why for any individual, we could be wrong, right? But we say over the course of thousands of individuals, we can infer based on a combination of what they say and what they do, right? That's why we pair this kind of self-report data, which, as you say, this is like intention action gaps are everywhere, right? People say one thing and do another.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Pair that with the kind of clickstream data, that's where we think we can get a better sense of why people are doing what they're doing. And there's one other kind of core metric, which I'm sure you guys have, through Rational Labs have heard us talk about again and again, which is an experiment, right? If we get a sense of, okay, here's what you've told us, here's what your clickstream data is on a given platform, we're going to make a targeted change to that. Maybe we have a bigger carrot, maybe reduce the risk, maybe we try to make, the increased trust and relationship building. We change one targeted thing that we think based on the proxies that we have, and we're making an inference here. And now we can run an experiment to test whether we're right. Right. So, and this is all in the inference game, right? I can't know for sure what any individual's core motivations are. Right. But I can make educated inferences and design experiments to see over larger groups of people whether that moves the needle.
Yeah, like for like health, for like, let's go into the physical world. So let's say you have somebody that says, I want to lose weight. And that's like a very basic motivation. There's a reason they want to lose it, but they can't get connected to the strong enough motivation. Even if you make it easy for them, you do all these other barriers, reduce all the barriers to allow them to do it. That motivation, if you get them connected to just the right thing of why they want it, it seems like then now they have enough intrinsic motivation to then get through whatever barriers they're gonna bump into in the physical world. I just don't know how you'd measure that, like as you're bumping along.
Well, I think I know we're running low on time. I think one key thing is to think of like behavior is always the end outcome that we're interested in here, and we want to make good inferences about why it's happening. But the end goal, if your goal is weight loss, our outcome measure, our measure of success, should be quantitative. How much weight did you lose, right? And if you want to try, like, okay, we think there's, 3 different possible options. One is, people just can't, it's too expensive to kind of constantly eat healthy or something, or join a gym membership. Okay, well then the solution there, if you're right about the cause there, the solution is money, right? Can you make it cheaper for people? Can you provide people with subsidies, right? If it's about, people lose their, basically lose motivation over time, maybe they need a social one. Maybe you pair them with a friend to do it together, right? So you can think of like different solutions. And then if you design a good experiment, you can randomly assign people to different versions and you can see which version wins. And if it turns out, oh, hey, this actually was about, money and cost, then that intervention should outperform in terms of weight loss, the kind of social intervention that I just came up with.
Yeah, I like that idea because you're talking about addressing barriers and prompts, because that's like those are things you can measure, right? Because you can do. But that one that you mentioned was social, because that's a motivator. So if you address that motivation of they don't want to work out alone, and they had somebody that they didn't have to pay, and they enjoyed working out with them, what they really want is a social time and and some other thing of working out at the same time, you're going to get a success there. As long as you can make now the person, like getting the person there with them becomes the barrier. Because now you need to work on that person
I think you're on the right track here of we're trying to identify the barriers and then testing solutions here. So, and again, this all involves uncertainty. We don't know for sure, but we can make informed estimates based off of, the things we talked about. But yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and you're thinking about it in the right way.
The hysterical thing about these open hours are it's always a slow burn. And then just as we're about to wrap, all this energy comes forth. And ordinarily I would let us go over a little bit, but I have to go, I'm so important. No, I have a meeting at the top of the hour. So we do need to wrap, but virtual or real, round of applause for Colin again, for all your mad genius. See, I'm a one-man sound effect. It's echoing. Remember, Colin's going to be back, I believe. Is that next week already? I think it is, right? Next Friday?
Next Friday, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So Colin's going to be back next week with his greatest hit, what's worth more, time or money? The answer is money. He's going to give you if you come. No, I'm just kidding. That was a perverse incentive that's not real. And not transparent, no trust. Terrible, terrible, terrible. But Colin's next week. And then Meeting Magic is this Friday with Lindsay. So I'll be there. Hopefully you'll be there. And if you ever want to have a question drop in advance or have like a teardown in advance, you can always DM me over at Slack. And then, you know, it's always nice for me to like get started with somebody who really wants us to look at X. Because as I pointed out, people always kind of take a while to get into the groove. So thank you everybody for your time and energy today. I hope we see you at the additional additional events this month. I had September in my head and Saturday came out. You know, stay out of trouble for the rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.